Good morning, and welcome to the AB 262 Environmental Product Declaration Introduction and Training brought to you by Cal State University. My name is Jeremy Gummeljak, and I'm a construction manager at CPDC. I just want to give you a quick look at our agenda today. Coming up first will be Aaron Clem with CPDC. He's the Chief Energy and Sustainability and Transportation. He'll be talking about why Buy Clean California is important to the CSU, followed by Brendan Jang from the Department of General Services. He'll be talking about the Buy Clean California Act. And then Catherine Spurl will finish us off with how to enter your EPDs into MetaBim. So I'll hand it to Aaron Clem.
Thank you, Jeremy. As Jeremy noted, I'm the Chief of Energy, Sustainability, and Transportation, and AB 262 is important to CSU for a number of reasons. We have 15 CSU campuses have signed carbon neutrality commitments that cover scopes 1, 2, and 3, which is natural gas and fossil fuel combustion on campus. Scope 2 is their electricity use, and scope 3 is travel and employee commutes. AB 262 addresses the carbon loophole, which is the carbon intensity of the materials we buy. And we've taken to calling that scope 4 emissions because it's the embodied carbon in the materials we buy. The bill authors for AB 262 call it the carbon loophole. So if you hear folks referring to the carbon loophole, this topic area is what they're talking about. As I mentioned earlier, this AB 262 and environmental product declarations are designed to get at and reduce the materials manufacturing carbon intensity, which is why the covered materials have been selected, because they're the most energy and carbon intensive materials that could be put into the law. The one thing that is clear from our discussions with DGS and the bill author's office, as well as the advocates out there for this law, is they intend to have this law cover other materials in the future. Specifically, the one that seems to be omitted is concrete, which is also very carbon intensive material. So with that, in addition to it's a good idea, our campuses have voluntarily committed to carbon neutrality. It also is the law, right? So the law requires CSU projects that are currently in design to reference the Buy Clean California Act in the specifications. So you set your projects up for success in the future, and that CSU requires the submission of environmental product declarations for the covered materials under this law, and prepare ourselves, as MetaBim and the construction management folks have done, with building out a great tool to make compliance with this law easier. And with that, I'll hand it back to Jeremy.
So next up, I want to introduce Brendan Jang. He's with the Department of General Services Procurement Engineering. He'll be talking to us about the Buy Clean California Act. Brendan, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. I am happy to be here today to talk on behalf of my team on the Buy Clean California Act. I work at the Department of General Services, as Jeremy has stated, and I am one of 4 team members in the procurement division. So without further ado, let's go to our next slide, where we'll be looking at our topics. So today I'll be going over the Buy Clean California Act, environmental product declarations, which construction materials are affected by the Buy Clean California Act, GWP limits, and how they're going to be determined by our team. When do EPDs need to be submitted? Verifying GWP for compliance, and then wrap things up with future limits and timeline. Next slide. So the Buy Clean California Act was signed into law in 2017 under AB 262. You can find the complete legislation today under Public Contract Code sections 3500 to 3505. What this act does is it targets the embodied carbon emissions in building construction materials. It does that by directing the Department of General Services to establish a maximum acceptable global warming potential limit for each eligible material that is highlighted in the law. So global warming potential, or GWP, materials with that value, that with the GWP above an established materials limit, cannot be installed for public works contracts entered on or after July 1st, 2021. So that's a very important note, because if there's a project that's been entered on before July 1st, then the Buy Clean California Act will not be applicable to that project. So GWP is reported in documents called environmental product declarations, and that will be the type of documents you'll use to verify whether or not your material is compliant with the law. Next slide. So environmental product declarations, what is it? An EPD is an independently verified and registered document that reports a product's environmental impact. It's like the nutrition label for a building construction material. And any program operator can create an EPD according to existing product category rules developed by another program operator. So a product category rule, or a PCR, is simply just a set of guidelines or rules that a manufacturer has to follow when they go to develop a environmental product declaration. And it's important to note here that an EPD does not have to be made by the same program operator that developed this set of guidelines. Any manufacturer can go to any program operator to request help in making their EPD. So once EPDs are developed, they are published on program operator websites, databases, or catalogs. And there are different variations of how a program operator will choose to present their library of materials. EPDs are generally valid for 5 years, and so after 5 years, the information in the EPD is old, and the manufacturer will need to go back out and acquire new data for their product and then re-update their documentation so then they're showing readers the most up-to-date information for their product line. Next slide. There are 3 types of EPDs. So the first type that we see are what we call a traditional EPD. This is an EPD that represents a single product or product group from a single company. This is where we get into the whole delineation between a facility-specific EPD or something else, such as a multi-facility specific EPD. The second type of EPD is a transparency report, and this is a Sustainable Mines' version of a traditional EPD. Now, Sustainable Mines is one of our North American program operators, and their goal with this type of EPD is just to reformat the technical information inside a traditional EPD so then it's easier to read for the user and it's easier to understand. The last type of EPD that you'll come across are industry average / industry-wide EPDs. These EPDs represent an average product made by multiple companies in a defined area or region. So these EPDs are most often held by trade association groups because they have the ability to collect all the environmental data from their members and then aggregate them all to create one representative EPD that defines that entire area, such as North America. Next slide. So where to find EPDs? EPDs, again, as I said in the previous slide, they are posted on program operator websites once they are developed and cleared and verified. So here on screen, you'll see 4 databases that were picked. So the first one is SCS Global Services Green Products Guide. SCS Global Services is another program operator in North America. And they have a Green Products Guide shown here where you can find EPDs on materials that they've made EPDs for. The second one is Sustainable Mines' Transparency Catalog. This is where you can find a wealth of information on transparency reports and also North American EPDs that they reference. Third, we have our UL Spot database. UL Environment is another North American program operator. They publish their EPDs on their Spot database. You'll have to make an account to download EPDs from there. And then lastly, we have the Embodied Carbon in Construction Calculator website. And so this is a recent tool that's been in development by the Carbon Leadership Forum up in Washington State, what they're trying to do here is they want to make a sandbox type area where you can map out your project's entire embodied carbon by picking materials that they've put into their database, and they aggregate all information from EPDs that they're taking from program operators. So it's a really neat tool, and you have to make an account for it, but it's out there. And right now, DGS is working with the developers of EC3 on a Buy Clean California Act filter. So ideally, what would happen is whatever material that is inputted into their calculator database, it should sort out and filter out the ones that are compliant to the Buy Clean California Act. So that might help out the awarding authorities later in the future. One thing to note is the EPDs on these websites are not screened by DGS. They are just how EPDs are published for the public to see. Next slide. The construction materials that are affected by the Buy Clean California Act are these 4 materials listed here on screen. We have structural steel, concrete reinforcing bar, flat glass, and mineral wool board insulation. Next slide. So GWP limits and how they are determined. DGS will have 7 maximum acceptable GWP limits for eligible materials published on its webpage by January 1st, 2021. And there's 7 because within each eligible material category, there are subcategories that exist underneath that need their own GWP limit. So these can't be rolled into one umbrella limit. And so for structural steel, we'll have 3 different limits. One for hot rolled sections, another for hollow structural sections, and then a third for plate steel. We'll have 1 for concrete reinforcing steel, 1 for flat glass, and then 2 for mineral wool board insulation, 1 for light density and another for heavy density. Next slide. And then the team will be determining these limits by following these 3 steps. Our first step is to, of course, obtain as much data as we can from publicly available databases of manufacturer EPDs. Then once we have all the data, we'll determine an average from that data, and then finally add a tolerance at the end to account for any variability that occurs between the GWP values. Next slide. So when do EPDs need to be submitted? Under Public Contract Code Section 3503C, it states that a successful bidder shall not install any eligible materials until that bidder submits a facility-specific environmental product declaration. And so we see that there are 2 options for the awarding authorities. So the contractor or the bidder / bidder can submit their environmental product declaration to you guys at either bid submittal or after contract award. If the contractor knows what material they're going to be using, then they could submit it in one package at bid submittal and have it all evaluated for compliance. And so that would work well. Or the second scenario would be the project actually takes more than 2-3 years, and so the contractor does not know exactly which material they'll be using or sourcing by then. And so at that point, it might make more sense for the EPD to be submitted in between that phase, so after contract is awarded to them and then right before installation, because that's the window you have before the material has to be installed. And so it's up to the awarding authorities to determine which scenario works best for the project in hand, and this might be a case-by-case decision. Next slide. So verifying GWP for compliance. What you want to do when you receive the EPD from the successful bidder is to compare the submitted facility-specific EPD's cradle-to-gate GWP value to the maximum acceptable limit for compliance. And cradle-to-gate, known in the EPD realm, is A1, A2, A3, and A1 being the collection of raw materials, A2 being the emissions generated from transporting the raw materials to the manufacturing site, and then A3, all the emissions that are coming out from manufacturing that construction material. Next slide. This is DGS's simple EPD verification checklist. We have just 5 boxes that we recommend the awarding authorities to check off when you're looking at an EPD. So the first one is to verify that the EPD that is in your hand is from a single manufacturer and a single manufacturing facility. And it can't be from a fabricator. So this word comes into play because there are 2 companies out there, 2 types of companies out there that can develop EPDs to the same PCR. And one of them is the manufacturer and another is a fabricator. The fabricator, their contributions to the whole GWP limit is not a big weight. We see that the manufacturer does more of the emissions because it takes more to make the product than to just simply bend, shape, or cut the material. So DGS's GWP limit will be based off of the manufacturer values. Second, you want to verify that the EP represents an eligible material that is called out in the law. Third, verify that the referenced PCR, or again, the set of guidelines that's used to develop the EPD, matches what is listed on DGS's Buy Clean California Act webpage. So we'll have the PCRs labeled on our webpage next to our limits that we have calculated. Some awarding authorities have mentioned to DGS that they may have different rules on expired PCRs. For example, in the second scenario in the previous slides where I talked about there might be a project that spans over 2 to 3 years. Well, PCRs are generally valid for 5 years. So there might be an exception in place where where an awarding authority may decide to accept a non-expired EPD to a PCR that was expired. And so that's up for discussion between your individual agency if that works for your agency. Fourth, you want to verify that the EPD was independently verified in accordance with ISO 14025. This is a simple checkbox because there's a signature on the second page of an EP that declares that the EPD's information was third-party verified, and it's an easy check to make sure that the data that you're looking at wasn't just self-declared by a manufacturer. And then lastly, you must verify that the EP that you're looking at is not expired by reviewing the date of issue. So next slide. So here we have an example of a facility-specific EPD. The first thing I want to highlight here is that this is the title page of an EPD, of course, and we're looking at steel concrete reinforcing bar and merchant bar products made by Nucor Steel Seattle, Inc. What you'll notice here is that there is an address listed in the front, and it is 2424 Southwest Andover Street. So this gives you an idea that there is a specific facility being called out in this piece of information. Jeremy, there's going to be a red circle that appears. Yep. Okay, and then next slide. So once you get past the first page, the title page, you'll get to the declaration information page. And this page just shows you the properties of the EPD. So first, you'll see the program operator, which is UL Environment, who helped develop this EPD. Second, you'll see who owns this EP, which is the manufacturer, Nucor Steel Seattle. Then you'll have the declared product. So it's steel, concrete, reinforcing, and merchant bar. This has to, again, match an eligible product. Oh, sorry, eligible material. Next is the reference PCR, and in this EPD, it is the North American PCR for designated steel construction products by SDS Global Services. Again, this has to match the PCR that we reference for our limit on our webpage. Next is the date of issue. So this EPD was published on June 2nd, 2017. It's going to be valid for 5 years. So if you add 5 years to this date of issue, so the EPD's contents will expire in 2022. And then lastly, at the bottom right of this screenshot, we have the signature by Wade Stout of UL Environment, declaring that this declaration was independently verified in accordance with ISO 14025. And that's it for the declaration information page. So next slide. After you pass the declaration information page, you get to the product definition page. And this is the place where the manufacturer has a chance to explain to the reader what they're going to be reading about. So the thing I'm highlighting here is at the bottom, we have a paragraph that says, the environmental product declaration represents a steel, rebar, and merchant bar quality produced via electric arc furnace from Nucor Corporation's mill in Seattle, Washington. So this paragraph tells you that the information that you're about to read is from a specific facility, specific mill in Seattle, Washington. So this is good so far because you're checking off all the 5 checkboxes in DGS's recommended checklist verification. Next slide. So in all EPDs, there will be a life cycle impact assessment section. And this is where you find out what the GWP value is and what you need, and that information will be used to compare to the limit. So the first thing you'll see is that there's 2 impact assessment methods. The first one is Tracy 2.1. This is a characterization method developed by the US EPA. This is a very important to note because DGS's GWP limits will be based off of the Tracy model. And what you want to do is compare Tracy values to our limit for an apples to apples comparison. The second one you'll see is CML 2001 version V4.1. This characterization model, although it's shown here in this EPD, it is mainly used in the European region. So it's good information to have, but again, focus on Tracy. So once you identify the Tracy values, you need to identify the cradle to gate value, GWP value, so that you can compare it to our limit. And in this case, the PCR that was referenced to develop this EPD is only cradle to gate. So with that known, you would just go to the result of 4.99 times 10 to the negative 1 metric ton carbon dioxide equivalent. You'll take that number and compare it to our limit on our web page. So if the limit is lower, then good. It's pardon me. If this number is if this 4.99 times 10 to the negative 1 value is lower than our limit, then good. This material is compliant with the Buy Clean California Act. If it's higher, then it's not compliant. Next slide. Next, we'll take a look at a transparency report example. And this is the type of EP that is developed by Sustainable Minds. So what we're going to be looking at here is black acoustical board and acoustical smooth board insulation. And on screen here, we have an image of where it would be used in a theater setting and some language on the left side to describe the board. Next slide. So even though the format of this EPD is different from a traditional EPD, the information should still, the properties of the EPD should still be all found in the transparency report. So here at the bottom left, we have an indicator that says that this transparency report was third-party verified checkmark by a small logo, a small blue logo of NSF. So NSF third-party verified it. The second thing is the validity is at the bottom left, and it was published on December 3rd, 2018, and so another 5 years, it will expire in 2023. One more arrow, Jeremy. Yep. So that's all the information for this slide. Next slide. So after you get past the first page, you'll get to the second page, which is the LCA and material health results and interpretation section. This is where you'll find out where you got your data, what scope of the lifecycle assessment was on, and all that other good information. So the first arrow will point out the title. The second arrow will point out the scope, which is cradle to grave. So this means that this transparency report will have more than just the cradle to gate information. So you'll have to be able to decipher or discern which values you're going to be taking to compare to our limit. And then lastly, at the bottom left, we have manufacturing data. This is where you identify where the environmental data was taken from. And in this report, it was taken from October 2015 to September 2016 from a location in Shelbyville, Indiana. Next slide. In this transparency report, the manufacturer has reported their values using the Tracy lifecycle assessment impact method, which is good. So it's important to note that global warming potential will not always be the first thing you'll see. So it is in the table, but third from the top. And there's also different numbers for each section of the life cycle. And then at the bottom left, you'll have the references section. So this this transparency report was developed to the UL environment PCR for building envelope thermal insulation. So again, this has to match the limit, the PCR that we reference on our webpage associated with the limit. Next slide. So now that you've gone through all of that information and it's time to compare the GWP values to see whether or not this material meets the Buy Clean California Act, you come up to this obstacle where the values are not aggregated as the new core steel example. So what you need to do is scroll through the transparency report and find out which information modules are included in which section. So here we have raw material acquisition, which includes A1 raw materials and A2 transportation. So this means that the manufacturer has decided to roll both those values into one column under one number. And then they have A3 manufacturing separated, so that value is isolated by itself. So to calculate the cradle to gate GWP value from this transparency report, you would take the 1.07 from raw material acquisition and add it to 8.14 of the manufacturing, as shown there. So once you add these, once you do the simple addition, what you'll get is 9.21 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent. So you would take this 9.21 and compare it to our limit and determine compliance. So next slide. So evaluating GWP for compliance. If the cradle to gate GWP value in your EPD that you're looking at, if that result is equal to or lower than the GWP limit, then the material is compliant with the Buy Clean California Act. If the result is higher than the GWP limit, then that material is not compliant with the Buy Clean California Act. At this point, when you have a non-compliant material, the awarding authorities has built in exceptions within the legislation underneath Public Contract Code 3503E. And so the Act calls out qualifiers such as technically infeasible or resulting a sole source. So it's up to each awarding authority to determine whether or not that project that they're having on their desk meets one of those eligible criteria to not apply the Buy Clean California Act. So that's a case-by-case basis, and it will be up to, again, the awarding authorities to decide. Next slide. So future limits and timeline. It is very likely, most likely, that there will be other materials that will be added to the Buy Clean California Act in the future. So when AB 262 started, there was much more materials listed than just the 4 that we have today. So if it's not going to be a surprise when after July 1st, 2021, there might be more coming down the pipeline. For timeline, January 1st, 2021, DGS will publish the maximum acceptable GWP limits for eligible materials and their sub-materials on our website. So again, that's going to be 7 limits. And then on July 1st, 2021, the awarding authorities will have to start engaging GWP compliance of eligible materials with EPDs. And that's coming up next year. So that is all. And thank you for having me here today to speak. And if there's any questions, please email us at buycleancalifornia@dgs.ca.gov, and we will get back to you. Thank you.
Next up, I want to introduce Catherine Spurl with MetaBim Incorporated. She's the Vice President of Operations. She's going to walk us through the database and reporting tool to demonstrate compliance with the Buy Clean California Act, Assembly Bill 262.
Okay, welcome to MetaBim's demonstration of the Environmental Product Declaration database that we've built out on behalf of CSU Chancellor's Office. It's a database and reporting tool that's designed to help capture environmental product declarations for each material across the projects that your campus is engaged in, to streamline reporting up to the Chancellor's Office and further to the Department of General Services for California. All right, so the first thing that we're going to do once we've logged into MetaBim is we're going to look for the declarations icon here. All right, when we click on that icon, we're going to come into the Environmental Product Declarations database. So from here, we see a search bar up at the top that allows us to search through and filter and look for the projects and click into those project records to see their associated environmental product declarations. To enter a new environmental product declaration, first we want to go ahead and start by creating a project record. We can do that by clicking on the link here in the top. When we click on the link, we come to our Create Capital Project page. Now, this page, inside of the capital project title here, is linked to the database of capital projects. So if your campus uses MetaBim's capital project database, or if you've already entered information for a BRIF record about this project, you're going to see the names of the projects populate in this list here. When you select a name from that list, going to automatically populate lots of information into this form for you to save data entry. If anything's missing or this is the first record of the project that you're putting into Facilities Link, you can go ahead and dial it in and edit and update as needed here. Once we're satisfied with our entry, we can click Create. And when we do, we come to an individual project record. So the first things that we see in this nice green summary box up here is all that information that we just entered about the project itself. If you're using Facilities Link to track your capital projects, you'll see a link to that project here. And on the right-hand side, if we already have a BRIF record for this particular project, we'll see it linked here. Additionally, if we want to create a BRIP record from here, we can use that add feature to do so. Additionally, if we want to update or change any of the information that we entered in this box, we can use this update project link to get back to that create project page with the opportunity to edit. We can also close and further delete this project if we decide that we need to start over or this is no longer applicable. All right, let's go ahead and start entering some environmental product declarations for materials associated with this project. We're going to start by clicking this add link right here next to the EPD entries. When we click that add link, we come to the create material entry form. This form is broken down into record details and then material details. In the record details section, the first thing we were going to want to take a look at is the program operator. The program operator is the third-party organization that granted the environmental product declaration to the material manufacturer in the first place. So we can go ahead and dial in who that person is or who that organization is. The next thing we can optionally choose to add is the material manufacturer. The Department of General Services at the time of this video is specifically looking for environmental product declarations that are granted to the manufacturer of those materials. We can optionally choose to dial in who that is. Next, we see the valid start date and the valid end date. We can type in the dates associated with the environmental product declaration here. And then finally, the declaration number. That gives us the basics about the EPD that we're looking at. Next, the next two fields for status and compliance give us a little bit of information about this environmental product declaration itself and its relationship to the standards published by the Department of General Services. The status lets us know if we've actually received this or if it's pending. And then compliance lets us know if the aggregate GWP is below the limit threshold published by the Department of General Services. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about this compliance field further in the presentation. Let's jump over and talk about material details. In order to talk about the material details or fill this information out, we're going to need to first dial in the material type. So we can select from this drop-down list the current materials that require environmental product declarations according to AB 262. We can dial in the material amount and also the units. Keep in mind that the units in which we report the material amount have to match the units in which the environmental product declaration is standardized on. This units drop-down list is only going to contain units that are approved by the program operators to publish their environmental product declarations in. The next thing we want to do is come to the EPD itself. We need to reference the environmental product declaration for some of this information. This information about the global warming potential appears in different structures across different EPDs. On this one, we're looking at raw material, transport, and manufacturing, A1, A2, and A3. This is the most broken out that you'll see GWPs reported for an environmental products declaration. Looking further down the EPD, we can see the results of the life cycle assessment here and letting us know what units this particular environmental product declaration has been standardized on. So when we report this particular EPD, we want it to be in terms of meters cubed. All right. The next thing we see here in line is global warming potential broken out into those three categories, A1, A2, and A3. When we come back to our material entry, we enter that GWP raw, transport, and manufacturing. What we're really looking for, however, is this GWP aggregate field. This GWP aggregate field is the summation of the GWP raw, transport, and manufacturing. So we want to add these three up and then enter them here into the GWP aggregate form. If the environmental product declaration that you're looking at has this information broken out in a different way, keep in mind that the end result of what you're really looking to report is this GWP aggregate here. Additionally, we can add a link to the environmental product declaration. So when we're on our program operator's website, we can pull the URL that pulls in that PDF. And when we put this in here, it'll allow us to, with one click, reach that PDF that's published on the internet. When we feel complete with our form, we can go ahead and click the Create button here. When we click Create, we come back to our project record, and we see under EPD entries the entry that we just entered. So we see the material type, the material amount in its units, the GWP for the raw materials, for the manufacturing, for the transportation, and then that aggregate GWP that we're really looking for. On the bottom line here, we can see the EPD number itself, along with the program operator, and a link out to that particular EPD. We see whether it's submitted and in compliance and the valid dates here. We can show and hide the details of this particular EPD by toggling back and forth. When we click hide, we'll just see that top line, and when we click show, we'll see everything. All right, so again, the show and the hide. If we made a mistake or we need to go back and fix anything on our form, we can click the edit link over here. That'll take us back to that form and allow us to make any updates. All right, now we said earlier in the presentation that we were going to come back and talk a little bit more about compliance, and now is the time to do so. So let's go ahead and add another environmental product declaration to this project. We'll start by clicking the add link here. When we come back to our form, I've gone ahead and filled out everything again, so everything we had talked about. And now we're going to take a look at this compliance field here. So when we select this compliance field, we're going to see a list of all the acceptable reasons that an environmental product can be out of compliance as dictated by Assembly Bill 262. If we change that to one of the acceptable out of compliance reasons here, so acquiring is technically infeasible is one of them, this reason for exemption field is now going to light up and be required. So here we want to dial in a short and succinct reason for why we are applying for an exemption for this particular material purchase for this project. Keep in mind that this also needs to be published on a public-facing website with information about the project to inform the public of why we are claiming an exemption for this material for this project. When we feel complete, we can go ahead and click Create here. When we come back to our project record, we see in line for the environmental product declarations that carbon steel rebar we just entered. We see the link to the environmental product declaration and the program operator. And then over here, right in the middle, we see submitted, acquiring is technically infeasible. So it gives us that short, predetermined reason for exemption, the as acceptable by AB 262 printed in line here. And it's also flagged red, so it captures your attention. All of the information that we enter within these projects is downloadable, so we can export this to Excel if we need to. All right. Additionally, if we pop back up to this overview of all of the environmental product declarations for your particular campus, we can see all of them lined out here, and then the totals, or whether this project has this type of material on it. Scrolling further down the page, we'll also notice that we can download the information here as well. And this will produce an aggregate download of all of our environmental product declaration information per project as needed to be submitted to DGS. Keep in mind as well that we can dial those dates in, so we can just look at declarations added for this quarter. All right, additionally, at the bottom of this page, we see bookmarks and resources. Here, you can choose to add additional resources for your staff to be able to reference for help using the particular database and or information about the Buy Clean California Act itself, or any information from DGS. That concludes our presentation for today, going through how to enter, maintain environmental product declarations for each of your projects. If you have any questions about how to access MetaBim or more information about the Buy Clean California Act, please reach out to the Chancellor's Office. And if you incur any technical issues or need any support, MetaBim is always available to help as well. And you can contact us at support@metabim.com. Thanks so much.
Awesome, Catherine. Thank you so much for your presentation. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely, anytime.
In conclusion, I'd like to thank all of our partners at CPDC, DGS, and MetaBim for this great presentation. For more information, please contact them via email.